Hi everyone. In my last presentation, I reviewed some of the key terms, the key trends in terms of Jewish life under the Byzantine Empire. And in this presentation, we're going to turn our attention to Jewish life in Babylonia. This is a map of how the lands where Jews live are divided up in the 6th century. The purple side of things is the Byzantine Empire, which we talked about last time. So my focus in this presentation is on the Jews of Babylonia who live between the Tigris and the Euphrates, here under Sasanian control beginning in the 3rd century CE. So some key terms when we talk about the imperial context for rabbinic life in Babylonia. The Parthian Empire is the name of the empire that ruled the land of Babylonia, Persia, before the rise of the Sasanians. But when we're talking about the classical rabbinic period, beginning in the 3rd century, after the close of the Mishnah, the Jews who live in Babylonia are under the control of the Sasanians. And the religion of the Sasanian rulers is known as Zoroastrianism. There are still Zoroastrians today. Zoroastrianism is a religion that has a strong sense of dualism, so that there is a strong sense of the divine, but that the good deity, who's known as Ahura Mazda, has an opponent who's almost equally strong, who is wicked. And alongside that strong sense of dualism between good and evil in Zoroastrianism is also a very strong sense of purity on the one hand and impurity on the other. So much of life of the universe can be classified as pure or impure, and some scholars think that this emphasis on purity and impurity in Zoroastrianism is reflected in Rabbinic Judaism's strong interest in purity and in impurity. Rabbinic life in Babylonia really starts around the time of the Sasanian Empire's emergence in the beginning part of the 3rd century, when a rabbi named Rav Abba, or Rav for short, establishes an academy on the shores of the Euphrates, which is called Sura. Soon after the establishment of Sura, a second academy and other academies as well are established, but the main one alongside Sura is Pumbedita. And for hundreds of years, the leading rabbis of Sura on the one hand and Pumbedita on the other are important leaders, not just for religion, but in civic matters as well for the Jews of Babylonia. Alongside these leaders of the academies is a third office of leadership known as the exilarch, or in Aramaic, the Reish Galuta, the head of the diaspora. The exilarch, or the Reish Galuta, is, much like the patriarch or the Nasi in the land of Israel, seen as the ruler of the Jewish community, the leader of the Jewish community in both an internally facing and an externally facing way. So the exilarch, or the Reish Galuta, would have been recognized as the leading Jew, the authority of the Jews, by the Sasanian rulers, and also would have been recognized as a ruler by the local Jews of Babylonia. We talked a lot about the different expressions of rabbinic and Jewish creativity in the land of Israel. When we're talking about rabbinic creativity in Babylonia, we're really talking about one great opus, and that is the Babylonian Talmud. That's the only work that is created, that survives from the Jews of Babylonia. But the story of how it emerges is a bit more complicated than the story of the emergence of the Palestinian Talmud. And it's been a real focus in rabbinic scholarship for the past generation. So I'd like to give you some of the highlights of how we now understand the emergence of the Babylonian Talmud. You're familiar, of course, with the generations of rabbis who are known as Amoraim. Amoraim are the rabbis that are most associated with the Talmuds. There are Amoraim in the Palestinian Talmud who come from the land of Israel, and there are also Amoraim in the Babylonian Talmud who come from Babylonia. And in fact, we know that there is a lot of communication among the two centers of rabbinic life. A lot of Amoraim move back and forth between the two rabbinic centers. And for a long time, we presumed that Amoraim were really the creators of both Talmuds. That's the story that's been more complicated in recent rabbinic scholarship. The two important contemporary rabbinic scholars who are best known for revolutionizing the way that we think about how the Talmud takes shape are David Weiss Halivni, Professor David Weiss Halivni, and Professor Shama Friedman. And in different ways, they both contribute to the new theory called the Stam theory of the emergence of the Babylonian Talmud. It goes something like this. Whereas the traditional view of the Talmud is one in which basically what we have in the Talmud is a record, a recording even, of the disputes and debates of the rabbinic academies. The new theory of Stam theory suggests that actually the Babylonian Talmud isn't simply a recording, but is something much more complicated that took a lot longer to come into its present shape. According to Stam theory, the Babylonian Talmud really is not the creation of the Amoraim, but it's rather the creation of generations of rabbis whose names we do not know, who lived after the period of the Amoraim, beginning in the 5th century, also in the 6th century, and in the beginning of the 7th century. So for over 100 years, the Talmud was taking shape, not as a mere recording of what happened in the study house, but rather as an artistic project in its own right that shows evidence of editing and compiling, but also shaping and reshaping of design. And we don't know the names of these rabbis who shaped the Babylonian Talmud into what it is today. But as scholars such as Weiss Halivni and Friedman have pointed out, if you open up the Talmud and read its pages, you'll find, as you probably have, that actually the material that is attributed to named rabbis, to Amoraim, is actually pretty minimal. The bulk of the material in the Babylonian Talmud is anonymous material. The stories are often told in an anonymous voice, and more than that, the dialectic or the dialogues that are very complicated argumentation with a lot of back and forth with questions and answers and challenges and responses, all of that is presented in the anonymous voice of an editor. Now, traditional Jews who studied the Talmud recognized that there was a lot of anonymous material in the Talmud too. And they just presume that what we have in this anonymous voice, this anonymous editorial voice, is recapitulating the thought processes of the named Amoraim. And the name that traditional readers of the Talmud gave to that anonymous editorial voice was the Stam. Stam means anonymous. It's only very recently that scholars in the wake of Weiss Halivni and Shama Friedman have begun using Friedman's term for those unnamed editors and saying it's most helpful to imagine not as a single voice that is somehow recapitulating the thought processes that really happened in the academy. It's much more helpful to think about these editors as creators of the Talmud, who, and because they lived over 100 years, rather than thinking of them as one unitary imagination. Friedman suggests that we could call them the so-called stamaim, the unnamed rabbis who, over the course of generations, gave the Babylonian Talmud its shape. Now, this term, the stamaim, comes as sort of a substitute for the way traditional Jews referred to rabbis of this period from the 5th to 7th century. The traditional term for these generations of rabbis was saboraim. And the saboraim were followed by the much more famous generations of the Geonim. The Geonim are the rabbinic authorities who are leading those famous academies of Sura and Pumbedita following the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And among those Geonim is one famous Gaon named Rav Sharira Gaon, who lived and taught in the 10th century. And the reason his name appears on this list of important terms is because he is responsible for giving us an early chronology or an early history of rabbinic life. Now, I wanted to highlight that alongside rabbinic culture, the academic culture that reaches its height in the production of the Babylonian Talmud, which is completed in the 7th century, there's something like a popular religious culture among Jews, much of which is shared with the other local people under Sasanian rule. We don't have a lot of evidence of what ordinary Jews were doing outside of the academies, but what we do have is an amazing collection, a treasure trove of these magic bowls that were excavated under private homes. We have hundreds and hundreds of them. And one of the key excavations was led by the University of Pennsylvania about 100 years ago. And so actually at the local Penn Museum in Philadelphia, we have many magic bowls, including the one that's pictured here. These bowls are like amulets. They combine words and pictures, and the words are often appealing to powers, to divine powers, for protection from illness, from enemies, from demons. So a lot of the magic bowls are written in Aramaic with Hebrew citations of scripture. They're also written in other languages that were spoken in the empire. They appeal to Jewish terms, to rabbinic names, but they also appeal to gods of other religions. And so this seems to be an aspect of popular religious life that's shared across religious boundaries. Just for fun, I wanted to show you some of the other illustrations that my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Simcha Gross, collected and compiled from other magic bowls. These are all pictures of demons from the magic bowls that were buried under the homes of Jews living in the Sasanian Empire. And before we close, let me just show you again some of the key settlements of Jews in the Babylonian Empire. You'll see it's what we call the ancient Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Jewish life is centered in Babylonia. And this map will help you appreciate the distance between the Babylonian community and the community in the land of Israel. And you'll remember that there are also Jews living in between. So Dura Europos, where we saw that abandoned synagogue that fell in the 3rd century, is right there in today's Syria along the Euphrates. There's a little reminder of how Dura Europos participated in both the culture of the Greco-Roman Empire and of the Persian Empire as a border town. And in this map, I wanted to show you that by the time that Islam arises, the Islamic conquest effectively unites what we had called as these two empires, these two centers of Jewish life. And beginning in the 7th century, the Jews in Babylonia and the Jews in the land of Israel are one